Charlotte Pierce was supposed to marry for her mother's sake. Instead, she fell in love with the one man in the house she could never have, and the house would not let either of them forget it. The proposal arrived in a letter addressed to the Pierce household on a March morning, and for 2 full days, Charlotte's mother, Mrs. Pierce, was convinced it was meant for her. The Duke of Carrow had taken notice of the family, the letter said, and wished to call. Mrs. Pierce had been a widow for 6 years, and had not stopped believing, in the private architecture of her own hope, that something might yet happen to her, and so she dressed carefully for the visit, and arranged herself in the best chair, and was utterly unprepared when the Duke arrived, and looked past her, directly and without apology, at Charlotte standing by the window. The misunderstanding lasted exactly as long as it took the Duke to say her daughter's name. Mrs. Pierce's face did something Charlotte would remember for years, a kind of collapse dressed up as composure, and from that afternoon onward, something in their relationship that had always been slightly strained became something else entirely, something with a current running underneath it that never fully went still again. Charlotte married Gerald Carrow in May. He was 51, she was 22, and the arrangement gave her mother and her 2 younger brothers a security they had not had since her father died, which was reason enough, she told herself, climbing into the carriage that took her to Carrow House. The house was enormous and cold in the way old houses were cold, beautiful in the daylight and full of corridors that seemed to lead nowhere particular after dark. Gerald was not unkind to her. He was simply absent in the way that busy, important men were, absent, and Charlotte spent the first months of her marriage learning the shape of a loneliness that nobody else could see, because she had everything a young woman was supposed to want. Julian was the Duke's nephew, 26, dark-haired, and entirely unprepared for how often he would find himself in the same room as his uncle's new wife. He managed the estate's accounts and lived in the East Wing and had the easy, unguarded warmth that his uncle had long since spent. He made Charlotte laugh within their first conversation, which startled her, because she had not laughed properly since the wedding. They began, carefully, to find each other in the library in the evenings, and what started as conversation became something neither of them would name for months, though both of them felt it arrive long before they admitted it had. By autumn, it was no longer only conversation. They told themselves it was harmless, that nothing had truly happened, long after that had stopped being true. They met in the garden after the house had gone to sleep. They exchanged notes hidden inside books on the library shelf. Charlotte began lying with a fluency that frightened her, not because lying came easily, but because she discovered she was willing to do it, repeatedly, for something she could not make herself give up. Julian carried his own guilt differently, in long silences at dinner, in the way he could no longer look at his uncle directly across the table. The household began to notice before either of them admitted anything to themselves. The housekeeper noticed the hours. A maid noticed the notes. Mrs. Pierce, visiting in November and still carrying the old wound of that first afternoon, noticed something sharper than either of them, the particular quality of guilt in her daughter's face, and said nothing, which was its own kind of punishment, because Charlotte understood that her mother had seen and chosen silence as a weapon rather than a kindness. The house grew thick with unspoken things. Servants exchanged looks. Gerald grew quieter, watchful in a way he had not been before, and Charlotte told herself this was simply the natural distance of an old marriage, and did not let herself examine why her heart moved the way it did every time he entered a room unannounced. It ended on a night in January when Gerald came home early from a dinner he had been expected to attend until midnight, and found the library empty when it should not have been, and a door at the end of the garden path closing a moment too late, and Charlotte's face when she returned to the house, telling him everything he had spent 2 months refusing to let himself believe. He did not shout. That was the part Charlotte would remember most clearly afterward, that he simply stood in the hallway and looked at her with an expression that had nothing left in it to perform, and said her name once, quietly, the way you might say the name of something you had already lost. What followed was swift and merciless, in the particular way that scandal moved through families with too much to protect. Gerald began proceedings to end the marriage within the week. Julian was sent from the house before Charlotte was permitted to speak to him again, and she never learned, not fully, where he went or what became of him, only that he did not write, not once, which told her something about the difference between wanting a thing in secret and being willing to stand beside it in the daylight. Her mother, instead of coming to her side, arrived at Carrow House only to retrieve what dignity could still be salvaged for the family name, and the conversation between them in the cold drawing-room was the last real conversation they would ever have. Mrs. Pearce said she had given her daughter every chance at the life she herself had wanted, and watched her daughter take it and ruin it from the inside. And Charlotte understood, hearing this, that the bitterness over that first misunderstood afternoon had never actually healed, had simply waited for a moment, large enough to be spent. Charlotte left Carrow House in February with a small settlement, a ruined name, and nothing else. The brothers she had helped support were quietly instructed by their mother to limit their correspondence with her, for the sake of their own prospects. And they did, and the silence from that direction was its own particular grief, the kind that arrived slowly over years instead of all at once. She took rooms in a town 2 counties away, where nobody asked questions because nobody knew enough to ask them, and she built a small, careful, unremarkable life out of the wreckage, teaching piano to other people's daughters and writing letters to her brothers that grew shorter and further apart until they stopped altogether. She thought of Julian sometimes, not with longing exactly. Longing required a hope that something might still be retrieved, and she had long since understood there was nothing left to retrieve. She thought of him the way you thought of a fire you had once mistaken for warmth, with a clear, cold understanding of what it had actually cost to stand so close to it. She thought of Gerald, too, and of the particular quietness in his voice the night he said her name in the hallway, and she understood, far too late to matter, that the steadiness she had once found dull in him had been the one true thing in that entire house, and that she had spent it on something that turned out, in the end, to be made of nothing at all. Charlotte lived a long, quiet life in that small town, and the story of the Duke's wife eventually faded into the kind of half-remembered rumor that towns generate and forget, useful only as a cautionary tale for other people's daughters. She never married again. In her later years, when one of her piano students asked her, with the directness only children have, why she had no family of her own to visit at Christmas, Charlotte said only that she had once had a family and had let something else matter more than keeping it, and that this was the kind of mistake a person only survived making once, because it taught you, completely and permanently, exactly what it cost. The girl did not understand the answer. Charlotte did not explain further. Some lessons, she had learned, were not meant to be passed on whole. They were meant to be carried quietly by the one person who had paid for them, for as long as there was a person left to carry them.